Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the expression of an endless human quest to build things better, faster, and more efficiently. It could take many forms. It could be something of great consequence, like the smartphone, or it could be simply striving to perfect a process. It's what drives us into a better, more efficient tomorrow, and it touches upon every aspect of manufacturing, from design to production through to the supply chain. Now, we in the UK are really good at this, but what we're less good at is commercialising the more tangible products of our innovation and building global businesses around them. So it's vital to understand this failure to capitalise on our brilliant ideas, what some people call the valley of death, and to fix it. And a very warm welcome. I'm joined as always by Jonny Williamson. Jonny, before we get going, the whole debate about how much money the UK spends on R&D has been thrown into something of a confusion with news from the ONS that they've changed the methodology by which they calculate that figure.
Absolutely, Nick. At the centre of the innovation conversation lies the government's ambition for R&D spending to hit 2.4% of GDP by 2027 and 3% longer term. This would broadly bring the UK in line with Germany, the US, South Korea. In November 2022, the ONS announced a major revision to the methodology it uses to calculate and measure R&D spend. And it's actually to give better coverage of smaller businesses who are increasingly responsible for a much larger share of R&D activity. The UK Innovation Report from the University of Cambridge sets out what impact that recalculation has had. And it's fair to say it's very much a mixed bag. So using the new system, UK R&D spend has actually increased by more than half. So that's positive news, and it actually means that we've hit that target of 2.4% much earlier. While good for the UK overall, however, it's not so positive for UK manufacturing. So industry has long been championed as the driving force of R&D, accounting for around 2/3 of total UK business R&D spend. Using this new system, the calculation actually means that R&D has dropped to less than half. I think it's around 44-45%. So given the opportunities facing the sector, it's really vital we increase that figure, as we'll hear throughout this programme.
Yeah, let's look first then at a crucial difference between the two broad types of innovation that we're going to be discussing. Here's Richard Jones, Professor Richard Jones from Manchester University.
There's a distinction between basic research and applied research, particularly the kind of research that you need to do to take an idea and turn that into a product. There's no particular magic about it. You just actually have to do the work. You have to put the money in, put the effort in. And the UK stopped doing that kind of applied developmental work. It puts in much less resource into that part of the R&D system than other countries. And entirely predictably, with no need for any kind of cultural explanation, we don't do very well at growing big companies that can address big markets at scale.
Well, that says it all, really. That reference to culture was in response to me wondering if actually in the UK we're temperamentally not very well suited to long-term patient growth. And as you heard, he gave me pretty short shrift. He said that if we wanted to do it, we could do it, which means what it really boils down to is that successive governments have made a choice not to support R&D to the same extent as in other countries.
Yeah, and that choice may have been and continues to be driven by the belief that increasing government spend leads to reduced private spend. So this belief that government spending effectively crowds out private investment, a belief that seems particularly prevalent within the Conservative Party and could go quite a long way to explaining the current fiscal policy, but also likely much longer as well.
Well, one man who really understands the importance of government support for R&D is Hermann Hauser, the founder of ARM, whose semiconductors are found in most smartphones around the world. He absolutely rejects this idea of public cash crowding out private investment.
Well, it's just wrong. You know, some things are right, some things are wrong, and some things you can't easily decide. But this one is just wrong. So there is ample evidence all over the world, most notably from DARPA, of course. DARPA created Silicon Valley. DARPA is also leading some of the latest developments in technology in the US, and lots of developments also in Europe, of course, were funded by governments. So governments do have a absolutely key strategic role to play, especially in new technologies where we know what we want. We know that climate change is a major problem that everybody agrees we have to solve, and it needs government money. Quantum computing, AI, these are all, and of course life science developments. These are all clear counterexamples to where without government support, you just won't get there.
Hermann Hauser. Now, in his interview with us, Professor Richard Jones from Manchester University said that the idea of public cash crowding out private cash took hold in the 80s and 90s, and that the UK became a kind of international testbed for this theory. One should point out that no other country in the world chose to follow this experiment. And what he said was it's very clear that it didn't work, because we ended up with the kind of regional inequalities we have today because of where public cash was spent and where it wasn't.
Absolutely, Nick. You only really have to look at the disparities between private investment in the southeast and elsewhere in the UK to know that's true. The southeast obviously also happens to be where the most government R&D money is spent, particularly in the big research universities. So it would seem that despite some of the funding arithmetic looking better than we thought, the UK does remain a bit of a laggard when it comes to public money, particularly supporting R&D, and then that in turn has impacted productivity and this regional inequality that we see today.
In broad brush terms, government money at the moment, yes, it goes on the pure research in the universities. As Richard Jones suggested, of course, it's the applied research that matters most to manufacturers. And there are there's one main source, Innovate UK, which is the UK's innovation agency, and they fund all kinds of research, from individual programmes to drive the UK national agenda, and that's very broad reaching. It goes from anything from advanced manufacturing right the way through to encouraging innovation from all walks of life. We've done programs here on Manufacturing TV with young innovators, and Innovate UK themselves say our goal pardon me, is to encourage innovation from all walks of life to really harness that national innovative spirit. It's quite inspiring, really. And of course, Innovate UK funds the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Like all the catapults in the network, their job is to take academic research, engineering technology projects that manufacturers come up with, marry them together and aim for the commercialization that really is at the heart of what we're trying to do in the UK, to develop national champions, big global businesses. Now, the Catapult Network came out of a review that Hermann Hauser was asked to conduct in 2010 by Lord Peter Mandelson when he was the business secretary in the last Labour government. Hauser saw the catapults becoming the kind of technology innovation centres like the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. And actually, he's pretty pleased with the way it's gone.
Well, there have been many improvements over the last 12 years, and the catapults have helped smooth the transition from out of universities into the commercial sphere. So the idea of the catapults has always been to be an intermediary institution between the university system and industry to smooth that transition, especially for companies that need access to quite expensive equipment like semiconductor equipment, large manufacturing equipment. It's not so relevant for software companies, but very important for hardware companies. And as everybody now realizes, you can't have the software unless it runs on some hardware. So hardware is actually also a very important part of the economic base of any country.
Hermann Hauser, and I have to say, incredible character. What a guy! The guy who started ARM, as I said earlier, that really is fueling the smartphone revolution, or has been over the last few years. Now, in the course of the interviews we've been doing for this, we really discovered there are conflicting views on what the catapult network, which really is at the, certainly in manufacturing terms, the high-value manufacturing catapult is right at the spear point of our drive, our R&D drive for a much more and better commercialized future. But as I say, conflicting views about what the catapult's mission should be. Now, Professor Richard Jones thinks the HVMC needs to be given a much clearer mission by government.
One of the features of the catapult centres in general, not just the high value manufacturing catapult, is I think they were set up with too narrow a view of what translational research was. I think there was a very particular view that there was just this gap in the funding landscape that needed to be filled. And I think the successful branches of the catapult, and I think of in different ways. I think AMRC has been a great success. Warwick Manufacturing Group, I think, has been very, very important for the West Midlands automotive sector in particular. I think the Centre for Process Innovation has been very positive for the chemical and process industry in the Northeast. And I think, in a sense, they've succeeded almost despite the way that they were set up. Because they were set up with a focus on particular technologies and a particular view of applied research, they weren't really given a mandate to think about how can we boost manufacturing capacity and innovation capacity in a given regional economy. And actually, I think, interestingly, all three of those examples, not the only ones, but they're the ones I know quite well, CPI, AMRC, WMG, all of them actually did do that job. They had leaders that thought that it was important that they did that, and they did step up to that. But in a sense, it's almost despite the mandate they were given by the government. So I'd like to see much more explicit focus on what centres like that can do for regional manufacturing and innovation systems.
One of Britain's greatest innovators, on a par, I believe, with James Dyson and his like, is Steve Lindsey, the inventor of the pioneering blade compressor and his business Lontra. Steve's had to navigate this process of commercialising innovation and bridging the valley of death we often talk about. And he believes there's a danger in coming to believe we know exactly what technologies to focus on and ignoring ones we don't.
People talk about we should have a catapult to just focus on semiconductors or compound semiconductors or something else. And I think those are good approaches, but it's very hard for a government or anyone else to predict globally where the next big innovation is going to come from. If you look at, what example I can think of, the jet engine with Frank Whittle, no one before would have set up a catapult for jet engines because no one even thought of jet engines. So I think you can't predict where in the country inventions are going to come from and what sector they're going to come from. To make an economy successful, you need to be able to support those moonshots of companies that could be in the Outer Hebrides but come up with a new type of nuclear reactor, for example.
Jonny, Steve Lindsey makes some great points there about potentially, if we're a little bit too structured, missing out on some of the technologies we don't even know about. But let's remember that Dominic Cummings, when he joined Boris Johnson in government in 2019, he came up with the idea for ARIA. And isn't ARIA supposed to be that sort of blue sky thinking moonshot agency?
I think so, Nick. Yes, ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, it looks to be built very much on the DARPA model in the US, focusing on very much high-risk technologies and projects, and is prepared to fail. At the moment, we can only speculate because it's not actually a thing yet, but they are recruiting for it, and it's hopefully going to come online fairly shortly.
Well, so far we've looked at how the Catapults and Innovate UK work together with manufacturers. Let's look at other ways that companies can access funding for innovation, and most importantly, funding for turning innovation into more successful businesses.
So the R&D tax relief system is a government incentive to effectively reward the time and money businesses put into innovation activities. By reducing the cost of innovation and R&D, it's designed to encourage innovation. There's two schemes, one for small companies and one for large companies. The large company is the RDEX scheme, so that's the Research and Development Expenditure Credit. So recent changes have been announced, and as always, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, they've reduced the amount of tax relief available for SMEs, while the larger companies actually get more. So that's a somewhat baffling strategy when you remember what I said right at the start of this programme about SMEs generating a growing amount of R&D. There's also talk of the SME scheme being merged with the larger scheme at some point in the future, possibly as early as April 24. The direction of travel probably suggests such a merger wouldn't favour the small businesses once again. And indeed, we've been told that merging the two schemes would be detrimental.
My personal belief, and the belief of many in the regulated sector, because we all took part in the most recent consultation, is that it's a bad move. It's simply a bad move, especially if you model it on the large company RDEX scheme, because that does prejudice most SMEs. And we all know that the SME marketplace is the backbone of the UK. So if there was to be a unified R&D tax relief scheme, it should favour the vast majority of businesses, which are SMEs. So it shouldn't be modelled on the RDEX scheme, which is the threat at the moment. I personally believe they should leave it as it was. Should leave the SME scheme as it was and the large company scheme as it was. Efforts over the last couple of decades to simplify tax matters just end up with more complications. It may be easier to police, but the whole purpose of R&D tax relief scheme is to encourage innovation, not to suppress it. The two schemes that we have at the minute work well, and the SME scheme definitely needs more encouragement, not less encouragement. There was a survey not many years ago. It really shocked me to the core. 70% of engineers and manufacturers that come out of apprenticeship models or third level education that have been head down. At that point, 70% of them had never heard of the R&D tax relief scheme. And then when it was drawn to their attention, they're often so knee deep in R&D, they see it as commonplace. And they don't see the work that they're doing as R&D. As a result, time and time again, I've come across manufacturers who are way above the curve that we're aiming to at the minute with autonomous factories. I get guys doing Industry 4.0 before Industry 4.0 was a thing, that had never availed of any relief at all, just thrashing away in the wilderness with no reward.
Well, SMEs, yet again, feeling they got the rough end of the stick on that one. In the autumn statement, the Chancellor was trying to suggest that quite a few spurious claims have been going through the system, perhaps fueled by over-ambitious and over-eager consultants. And of course, we've seen a proliferation of consultants in the space saying, "Hey, we'll get you we'll boost your profits by getting you some R&D tax relief." I suppose if you're an SME manufacturer, well, what are you going to do?
I mean, you've got to feel for the SMEs because these are the companies that need the relief the most, but don't necessarily have the time or the expertise internally to claim for it themselves. So they outsource to the experts. And I think a small number of these experts have been, as you say, putting spurious claims through. And unfortunately, it's tarred everyone with the same brush.
And it was an attack on the tax credit system in the autumn statement. Caused howls of outrage and, of course, was something of an open goal for the Labour Party.
It was just like an example of how this government gets it so wrong. It was done with almost, actually zero consultation. So it was just announced in the autumn statement. the money was taken away in, I think it was in November, and companies would, of course, they would have been planning their R&D expenditure from April this year. So they suddenly found themselves, some companies, small manufacturers were facing I think it was an average of £100,000 per each one in lost R&D income, and that was income which they would have reinvested in research and development and creating jobs and setting up manufacturing, etc. So it was badly done in terms of the issue it was addressing, and the higher levels of fraud in SME. R&D tax credits. Obviously, that's an issue, and we are, absolutely have to have, public value for money. But talking to SMEs, there are other ways of addressing it, such as requiring audited accounts from those who are applying for R&D tax credits. Or there were other ways of addressing it. This was really about snatching back some money, sort of, in order to balance or cook the government books, and it was badly done. And the impact, the impact is because that happened at the same time as we were losing ERDF, European Regional Development Funds for regional science and development as well. So it was really, a double whammy. In fact, it's a triple whammy because the other funds were drying up as well.
It's hard not to disagree with Onwurah that it was an incredibly ham-fisted way of going about things. But actually, not everybody agrees that R&D tax credits are the right way for government to offer direct funding for innovation, particularly among SMEs. Professor Richard Jones among them.
The UK is actually an international outlier in how much support it gives through R&D tax credits rather than through direct support for R&D. And in a sense, this reflects a kind of Treasury view that the Treasury takes the view that government doesn't really know anything and it's no point trying. I think the R&D tax credit system has got very, very expensive. If you look at the numbers, there's been a very, very large increase in amounts claimed. So I think it's a very blunt instrument, and I think there are places where it's very valuable. It's certainly very valuable, particularly for small, R&D intensive companies. It's if one thinks of the kind of business plans of high growth R&D intensive startups, scale ups, it's a very big part of that. But I think it's been too broadly applied. I think it's probably very expensive compared to other parts of the system. I mean, to be blunt, I think if the government wants companies to do more R&D to support goals that it has, it should directly contract with companies to get that R&D done. So I think there's a role for more targeted funding of R&D in companies than simply relying on the tax credit system.
So we've heard some pretty strong arguments for government to have a carefully worked out, more comprehensive policy on supporting R&D at the applied as well as the pure research level. But what do we want the impact of it all to be? What would make our economy stronger? Now, people have talked for donkey's years about the idea that we need more M's in the SME landscape, more companies like the Mittelstand in Germany, companies that really have got the muscle to take innovation from concept through to commercialization and on to become national and global champions. And we seem to keep faltering when it comes to doing that. Why is that?
Well, Steve Lindsey of Lontra believes, and I happen to agree with him, that it's a function of the way our system of capital operates.
It's all about appetite for risk. And then it's about how government can do risk and make things easier. So the UK investment market, historically, there's a good appetite for risk in the very early stage. So there's a lot of funding for early stage ideas because lots of people like the excitement of an early stage idea, and it's not a huge amount of money to support an early stage company. The problem this country has, and has had for a long time, is actually in that scale up and growth, because that takes much larger sums of money, but also takes longer investment horizons in terms of scaling a company to be a significant successful company in the UK or anywhere is going to be longer than the 3-year timeline that lots of people put. So you need to encourage a longer term investment. I think at the moment, the market challenges in that scale up. There are lots of funds who aren't willing to take the risk, but also that where there is a risk, the fund is a little bit small. You fall between two places. Where you're looking for the 5 to 10 million, it gets the same amount of effort for the fund to do a 30 million deal. So they'll generally focus on that where it's difficult. And in these areas, it is difficult because they are startups and new areas which they don't know much about. And I think that's the real opportunity for government to really change the way this works. I think we have to look at it from the other way round. We look at it from the institutions and the investors of what would make it easier for them and drive what we all need, which is longer term investment to build sizable companies in the UK, rather than companies that get success and then get sold off to another big company.
So yes, long-term investment, patient capital, as Steve said. A lot of people in the industry feel that there needs to be much more of that if we're to achieve that long-term goal of having these larger, middle-sized, medium-sized companies. One of the people really leading that call is Ewan Lloyd-Baker. He was CEO of Hayward Tyler, itself a medium-sized engineering company. He's now building a digital manufacturing group of companies called iCubed.
It's not necessarily about trying to persuade the short-term capital to invest longer term. It's about saying, okay, well, there's a place for short-term capital, but actually then how do we redeploy some of the long-term capital that tends to be focused, let's say, more on property to businesses where actually to develop the IP and ultimately to develop the opportunities on the back of that IP, you're looking probably at a 5-year cycle or a 10-year cycle, and therefore where can we go for that sort of support? And then looking to sort of various different financial institutions, perhaps to sort of be targeted or to be favoured in terms of how they actually deploy that.
So one of the changes that Ewan's talking about is a plan by the Chancellor announced last year to get pension funds to change some of their investment protocols so that they can invest in UK PLC. It sounds like a good idea.
Quite, but I think he's probably got a bit of a fight on his hands. Pensions like ultra-stable investments for obvious reasons, and it's because investing in business can often be far from that the industry is fighting back.
Well, whichever route the Chancellor goes down, and we'll know more in his July financial statement, it's obvious that something does have to change because there just isn't enough long-term capital in the system for some of the most promising R&D that could very well end up creating world-beating products and companies.
Well, it's an absolutely critical issue because innovation cycles, especially in life sciences now, challenge the 10-year fund cycles of venture capital. It just takes longer than 10 years to develop a drug, and many of the other breakthroughs in life sciences, but also in computing, especially with the great excitement that we all have about quantum computing. Which will again revolutionize the complete computing environment with the prospect of having exponentially more performance than classical computers. And this is quite staggering. This is not factors of a few percent or even a factor of 10. We're talking about factors of many thousands and millions. So it's a very fundamental change, allowing us to solve problems that we thought we will never be able to solve, like the binding of drug molecules to proteins, factorization, which gives our spooks a great headache because quantum computers will be able to crack RSA 2048, which is our main encryption standard. And it will also solve many of the logistics and optimization problems. So it's a very exciting development, but it does need a long-term policy. And I must say, I'm very impressed and delighted that Britain has decided to put 2.5 billion euros into the quantum sector. This is an unusually far-sighted, and it's following 2 billion that Germany has spent on it a few years ago, and France 2 billion, but it's better late than never.
Well, the most compelling argument in all of this has to be that Britain needs a national investment bank, precisely there to fund this long-term investment.
Sure, and I mean, we have the British Business Bank, which would seem the most likely vehicle of that. But at present, I'm not sure it's really there. It provides advice and guarantees, as well as acting as something of an intermediary in the financial markets, but it's not really a source of prime long-term investment capital.
Ewan Lloyd-Baker made the comment to me, half in jest, I suppose, but of course the UK does have its own nationalised bank. It's called the NatWest. He said, why can't we get them to do the funding? Why doesn't government get them to do it? As I say, half in jest. So let's recap. We have a call for more government funding across the board, applied research being given as much attention as pure research, a reform of the way SME innovation is supported. As we've just heard, we've got a call for access to more patient capital capable of funding 10-year investment cycles and longer. So what else should we and manufacturers be looking for?
I think it's something along the lines of what Steve Lindsey was saying, to beware of not just of today's manufacturing imperatives and technologies, but tomorrow's too. Climate change and net zero, decarbonisation, digitalisation, these are all seen as very big, daunting challenges, but they hold great opportunities as well. Ewan Lloyd-Baker thinks that if we innovate our processes correctly and present that innovation as part of the sea change of UK manufacturing, then we can really start to make progress on some of those big challenges and transformations happening.
Innovation of our manufacturing processes, innovation driven by AI, going into a factory and saying, right, well, actually, we can look at this in an innovative way and, produce 2x on half the amount of input. That is perhaps not as exciting or not as newsworthy, because you're probably doing, basically more with less. But it is going to be, I think, an increasingly important part of, let's say, UK manufacturing, because, one of the justifications for doing things back in the UK is for the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've outsourced a lot of that, let's say, our emissions to countries which are in the Far East. And what we're finding now is similar to what's going on in the food industry, from field to fork. Consumers or businesses are much more interested in, okay, well, I want to know the provenance of what I'm eating. Well, if you sort of carry that through, I think that trend over the next 5, 10 plus years, it'll be, well, okay, what were the carbon emissions that were produced in order to produce this, component or this sub-assembly or this assembly? Because I need to say that, ultimately I need to tell my end customer that. And I think if we start joining those dots, we'll find that actually manufacturing in the UK is much more, let's say, environmentally friendly, looked at holistically, than doing it elsewhere, where you don't have control, and then you have to ship it, and then you have all the associated risks with how long it's going to take and the additional time and expense and cost. So even though we might have higher input costs here, we can probably still reduce emissions through, innovative manufacturing.
And that's really the point, isn't it? As Ewan says, manufacturers are always coming up with new ideas, processes, products. And while there's some seriously good R&D support programs in place, let's not do everything down. There's some really good stuff going on. The funding mechanisms need to be much more flexible and agile to keep pace with the way the sector's moving.
And that's absolutely critical, Nick. Policymakers are reacting, but according to Hermann Hauser, not as fast as maybe they should be or could be.
Well, I don't think politicians realized how important to the growth of the economy the innovation system actually is. I think now, with hindsight, most politicians agree that the government needs to do more, not just in the regulatory framework to support innovation, but also support innovation directly with funding through the venture community, through funder funds, but also increasingly importantly, and that's most nations still don't do this very well, through innovative purchasing. So you cannot take a purchasing organization, as we have in the UK, and many other Western countries have the same emphasis on buying the lowest cost solution, which is a very sensible and laudable aim, of course, given that we're spending taxpayers' money. But you can't take people who have been trained to do that and tell them 1% of the time you need to do innovative procurement. So we really need to have a separate innovation procurement part of our procurement infrastructure. And this is a proposal that we've recently made at the in Brussels, where I'm one of the members of the EIC, the European Innovation Council, which is our 10 billion euro investment in deep technology. And hopefully we will have a European initiative that I always hope Britain, of course, will participate in, despite the Brexit idiocy.
No punches pulled by Hermann Hauser there. Of course, one of the potential casualties of Brexit, it's not a done deal yet, but is UK access to the Horizon 2020 programme, a fantastically successful EU programme from which UK researchers got a disproportionately large amount of money. I think it was something like 25%. Now, what's the score with Horizon 2020? Are we shut out completely, or is there a chance we might still get back in?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, or rather the 95 billion euro question, because that was the budget of Horizon 2020, set to run through till 2027. Our continued association with it is still yet to be ratified. There's talk of potentially the UK government introducing its own version, its own equivalent, but until more detail around that is released, we're kind of in a bit of a holding pattern.
And what's really interesting is that the government is still keeping the Horizon 2020 process going, almost getting the applications from people who want to take part in Horizon 2020 but who can't apply directly. They're processing the applications themselves so that if they actually do negotiate their way back in for the UK, which I think nobody would really disagree with, it's a fantastic programme, then in a sense we're not having to start from square one again. Okay, we've seen and done an awful lot in the course of this programme. Let's now look at recommendations, because that's what we like to do with this series. We like to look at what's happened and then come up with some ideas for ways in which things can be done better. And here's a selection of ideas from some of the people we've been interviewing for the show.
I think the modern way to do manufacturing business is the modern way to do R&D as well. So I think working in consortiums, the whole idea of reshoring, back to the Valley of Death as well, the risk of failure can be hard to pull yourself out of, and it can last for many years afterwards. It is the nature of invention to have a go and fail. That's the ethos of R&D tax relief. You know, if you hit it first time, it's not going to be R&D really as a competent professional. But spreading that risk by working in consortiums, and I would say R&D joint venture collaboration is a great way to de-risk that Valley of Death, shorten timeframes.
I think one of the challenges of government is it's very easy to latch on to sort of, the big new shiny thing or toy in the toy shop, so to speak. Actually what's much more difficult is to say, look, we're going to create a stable environment and a strategy which actually supports the individual inventors, the individual innovators actually working out what it is and the business opportunities that they want to create. The danger of a government deciding, well, we're going to invest in these particular sectors is no sooner have you sort of deployed capital into that sector, then you're missing out on actually a number of the other sectors which are up and coming. I think, advanced manufacturing, I'd argue that almost all of manufacturing is advanced, or particularly, the UK is becoming increasingly advanced because, we haven't been able to compete if it wasn't advanced. And the blur between, it's interesting to talk about the government getting excited about creative industries. Well, I'd say, manufacturing is one of the most creative industries because it's had to be in order to compete, not just in the UK, but on a global scale. So from my perspective, what makes much more sense, and it's not about the money, is it's just about providing that sort of framework and that long-term view that you say to the generation of, let's say almost school leavers today, look, we've got a plan here that if you go into business or if you decide that you want to go and be innovative and creative over the next 10, 15, 20 years, then we're going to support you. And, do that without the fear of, well, the next change of government is then going to, undo everything. They're going to change the name of everything. And then we'll all be left wondering, scratching our heads going, well, I thought we were trying to do the right thing from a societal and from a country perspective, only to be told that, we got it wrong because we're in the wrong sector.
What we need to do now is focus on protecting our innovators and our strategic capabilities now, and growing them, and perhaps some of the what the policies that we can put in place through our industrial strategy. And it's so important to have an industrial strategy. Without an industrial strategy, you cannot see the context in which a company like Arm grows, or its impact on our national security and our economic prosperity. So we would put in place an industrial strategy. It would be supported by an industrial strategy council, which would it would aim to end the farce by which you have long-term plans or long-term strategies. This government has had, I think, so many of them, I've lost count, and they don't last in the parliamentary electoral cycle. So we'd put in place a statutory council to support an industrial strategy and take it out of try to take it out of the political knockabout.
I can't begin to imagine what it's like if you're trying to build a business in this enormously unstable environment. So I think there does need to be a national consensus about this. And, ideally it should be a bipartisan consensus. There should be some long-term institutions put into place. And as I say, the Industrial Strategy Council, I think, was a good idea. But, if that had been a statutory body that actually, was stuck into the system a little bit, and one thinks of the Office for Budget Responsibility, for example. I mean, that's quite a good example of a new institution that was brought in on a statutory basis. And it's really pretty much dug into the system now, and it affects how economic policy is made on really quite a long-term basis. So if there was something like that and some consensus about, what we were going to do as a nation for the next 10 or 20 years, I think that would make life much better.
To create a great company like Lontra, there's a time. So I think you would expect this to be done in 7 to 10 years to be into full production. It's taken us considerably longer than that because of the challenges of funding. And I think had we been able to unlock this earlier, we could have built this much quicker. So I think there is an element for the country in terms of policy of moving these companies quicker. I think what it also leads to is, to some extent, I don't know how you describe it, almost a stagnation of skills. Because if you look at the US, you have a number of founders who found a series of companies who then go on to be successful. Some don't become successful, some do, but they can move through and create a number. Had we built Lontra in 7 years, for example, we could now be on our second Lontra, which would be saving a load of energy in another area. Whereas in the UK, you get a lot of founders who, because it's been such a long and hard journey, finally exit and retire to the countryside. And I think that's a great loss for the country. You've got someone who's, in that period, developed from founder into someone who's now knows the business of innovation inside out, if they've got to the end of that journey, and suddenly they're paid off and those skills are lost. And I think we need to find a way of encouraging innovators to continue innovating, because that's what makes the country valuable.
The main change is to do a lot more. It needs to be on a bigger scale. The speed with which we can now translate these breakthroughs from universities into marketable products has increased a lot. Which means that the speed, that the amount of money and the amount of effort that needs to go into these new technologies is also much higher. I mean, the most spectacular example is GPT-4 with ChatGPT, which now has 1 billion users. It was only launched about 6 months ago. So these are all speed critical things, because if we fall behind, our competitors, and clearly the US and China are ahead of us. This is to our disadvantage.
My grateful thanks to Jonny Williamson and, of course, to our distinguished guests. Funny, isn't it, how all roads yet again seem to lead back to government and the need for them to have greater clarity of vision and to build a collaborative partnership with business to develop that long-term foundation that gives our innovators confidence not only to research and develop, but most critically to manufacture here in the UK.